Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C. at the Center for a New American Security to talk to Dr. Patrick Cronin, who is the director of the Asia program here. Patrick, thanks very much for your time.
It's my pleasure, Vago.
Shinzō Abe called snap elections. He seems to have reaped quite a reward for doing that, giving Japan some stability at a very key time, despite some economic challenges and other issues that he's got on his plate. Talk to us a little bit about what Abe's renewed mandate means, especially for Japanese security at a time when Japan, or at least the government, is trying to be a little more muscular than even the population is willing to accept at this point, when there's a North Korea crisis that's ongoing, at a time that, despite some deep Japanese skepticisms regarding President Trump, Abe has struck a good relationship with Trump and wants to use it. Talk to us a little bit about what the extension of his mandate means.
Well, before the snap election, Prime Minister Abe was declining in the polling numbers, and he had already been the most successful prime minister for passing security legislation and normalizing Japan's security role in many ways, but he didn't yet fulfill his legacy of legitimizing, even in the Constitution, the role of the self-defense forces, which are technically outlawed under the Article 9 of the Constitution of Japan. This snap election has given him new life, not just for the next 3 years, but with supermajorities in both houses of the Diet. He can now pursue that constitutional change that will legitimize the self-defense forces. It doesn't mean that Japan will use force. It just gives future prime ministers the right, like other countries, France, the United States, the United Kingdom, to be able to put those forces into collective self-defense roles with the United States, or unilaterally Japan defending the Japanese home islands. And so this is a very important win for the Prime Minister, but selling that constitutional change remains a very fierce domestic battle in the months ahead.
How have Japan's allies seen this? Because the normalization has rekindled, in part because the Prime Minister has insisted to go to the Yasukuni Shrine, for example, which is a kind of a hot-button issue. And some nations in the region, while they see Japan as key to their economic success, Japan being a nation that rose from the ashes but then invested heavily in all the nations in the region, some Japanese say that was by way of apologizing and making atonement for wartime sins. But there's still concerns in Korea. You've seen that even in Korea. Have those concerns been allayed of a rise and a remilitarism of Japan, which is how some critics are portraying it, or even some in Japan have sort of seen it that way?
Well, history lives in Northeast Asia and in Asia generally, there's no doubt, much more than in the United States. But we are 70 years after the end of World War II. The demographic changes alone in Japan are making Japan a country of 100 million versus the 150 million they were just a couple of decades ago. So the demographic trends, the aging of Japan, make it very difficult for them to think about a very muscular military role, and yet they're technological leaders. They're still one of the largest economies in the world, and now with normalization under Prime Minister Abe, this could really make Japan a valuable ally, not just now, but in the decades ahead. The sensitivity with other countries in the region, China will oppose this. China will use Japan's normalization as a history card, in effect, even while China is the one working at breakneck speed to modernize the People's Liberation Army. Indeed, at the 19th Party Congress in Beijing, they're talking about the People's Liberation Army has to have the highest technology in order to play the global role that China should be playing in the world. So on the one hand, they're working at breakneck speed to improve the PLA. Japan's making fairly incremental movements to be a normal military, and China will blast that. In Korea, which is, of course, the other key U.S. ally in Northeast Asia, there's still tremendous divisiveness on this issue about how much Japan should be doing in the military role. And under the fairly progressive regime of or government of Moon Jae-in, the current president of South Korea since this May, there's concern within that constituency of his party, the Minju Democratic Party of Korea, whether Japan should be so normalized. And I think this could be a divisive issue. What's saving us from that divisiveness at the moment are the actions of North Korea and Kim Jong-un.
I want to get to that in a moment, but Mount Fuji Dialogue is going to be on Friday and Saturday. I think you're going to be heading over there, working on your frequent flyer miles. I know how robust your travel schedule is. A Japanese cabinet shows up for that. It's a very, very important event. Talk to us about what some of the key agenda items are going to be now that Abe has secured a few more years under his belt as Prime Minister.
Well, this is the fourth annual Mount Fuji Dialogue that Nikkei sponsors, and Kurt Campbell, our chairman of the board, Richard Fontaine, our president, Dan Kleiman, our new fellow on the Asia program, and I will all be there in Tokyo with essentially the U.S. alliance manager set and managerial set, so former assistant secretaries, current officials, and it's always a great discussion about now after the election that has boosted Prime Minister Abe's political fortunes for the next 3 years. What exactly will we be doing, not only with respect to North Korea in the short term, but in terms of U.S.-Japan alliance coordination mechanism, something that's being tested on North Korea but could be tested in the future in the Senkakus, in the East China Sea, for instance, or other operations outside of the East China Sea and off the Korean Peninsula that Japan may engage in with other allies and partners of the United States, like Australia or India or countries in Southeast Asia and the South China Sea or in the Indian Ocean. So this is a time to talk about the operational and strategic role of Japan with the U.S. alliance, but also with other U.S. allies and partners throughout the Indo-Pacific. And it's very important that President Trump has picked up the same language as Prime Minister Abe to talk about a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. This is now a point of commonality between Washington and Tokyo that has really cemented the U.S.-Japan alliance in 2017, despite the fact that we have such change in leadership in the region.
And you're going to have to change your map, actually, to have a better Indo-Pacific map. Let me ask you about what has to happen about those regarding alliance cooperation mechanisms. Japan and the United States have been allies for decades, have worked alongside, but have never been fully integrated. Friends will always say that, there's one headquarters in one place. Now many of these headquarters have been physically starting to be co-located. Staffs are starting to be integrated. Talk to us about that process and how much more that we have to go right down even to munitions stockpiles, right? Because it is the Japan self-defense force or the maritime self-defense. Everything is couched in a defensive context. And so offensive weaponry has not been a strong suit of the Japanese military, for example, which is something that Abe and the administration is working on. Talk to us about all of these dynamics as Japan works to build up its organic military capability.
It's an interesting paradox because on the one hand, Japan has the most advanced hardware. It's the most interoperable naval and air force with the United States in Asia, and yet it's been constrained by both constitution and by political will by previous prime ministers not to be integrated. So unlike the U.S.-South Korean relationship where we have a long-standing integrated command and control, in Japan this is a relatively recent phenomenon. You talked rightly about co-location and at Yokota, for instance, and putting operators together so they're sharing early warning data. Well, since 2015, when new defense legislation was passed, national security legislation was passed by the Diet, as well as the new and latest U.S.-Japan defense guidelines, the sort of instructions, if you will, that both countries agreed to on how to move forward with the alliance, there's a desire to more closely integrate these things through an alliance coordination mechanism. This mechanism is actually being tested in the recent weeks over the North Korean missile test that flew over Japan, and it's essentially been operating 24/7 now in terms of mid-level officials in the Pentagon and at the Ministry of Defense in Tokyo trying to communicate what's happening, how do we respond to potential crises. Now, making crisis management sustainable is a very big task. We've been able to do this kind of joint integrated work at sea sometimes, especially with Japan logistics for U.S. naval forces. But this is the first time you're actually asking the two countries' defense forces to integrate at a high level, potentially, for dealing with crisis stability, to deal with crises that could arise very quickly with a missile test or missile launch from North Korea, a nuclear test, or could arise in the East China Sea over the Senkaku Islands. So very important issues going forward about how the U.S. and Japan are going to integrate essentially the command and control functions for dealing with real operational challenges.
And clearly one of the factors that's also mitigating some concern, there are many who would agree with you on the point that it's been 70 years since the end of the war, and the security situation dictates that Japan step up, as it did when the Cold War began, in order to take sort of a more prominent and positive role, which is seen across the region well, obviously one of the hard things is Korea because of the unfortunate history there and some of the rhetoric. Has there been any change, by the way, just the last question on this, in Abe's rhetoric that was setting off particularly some of the Korean leadership? Has the Prime Minister done anything to sort of soften his language, to engage, to strike that apologetic tone? I think that Koreans always want to hear from Tokyo as opposed to one of regret or insincere apology, which is how some Koreans see it.
It's a very controversial issue. There's no one view of this. It really depends on where you sit and what your history is. What you can say is that compared to just 2 or 3 years ago, when Park Geun-hye, the former president of South Korea, a conservative like Abe, was at loggerheads with Prime Minister Abe about the comfort women, the sex slaves, if you will, of the war and colonialization before that. And there's still a lack of resolution on that issue. They made brokered a deal. It allowed them to move forward with GSOMIA, the information intelligence sharing agreement that has been so key for sort of readiness on the part of Japan and Korea to work together with the United States in a North Korean contingency, for instance. What you can see under Moon Jae-in's election, because of the unusual election, it was not a normal election. There was impeachment, as you remember. Right. There was an interim government, and then there was a special election. The progressives came in under President Moon. And despite the progressives coming in and this being a very sensitive issue in terms of the history question for South Koreans, there has not been some kind of rupture in this relationship, just the opposite. I attribute this mostly to Kim Jong-un in North Korea, but at least the Prime Minister of Japan has been very even-keeled on this issue. He hasn't gone out of his way to do anything but try to move forward with Korea. And to South Korea's sort of credit, they've been moving steadily forward on cooperation. So trying to depoliticize the history issues, which are very sensitive and will be with us for the rest of our lives and lives of our children and grandchildren, let historians and let experts try to deal with the common history and what really happened. But in terms of governing, let's try to figure out how you cooperate on your national interests. And I think both Seoul and Tokyo are doing a good job of that.
Let me take you to the President's trip. President's going over to Asia for 12 days, very ambitious trip. China being a very important part of that, but also meeting with our allies. Joe Dunford, Jim Mattis, also in the region, working some of these agenda items. What are we going to see from the President's trip? What is he going to be rolling out? What are going to be some of the key deliverables at a time when some in the region look at the President as having exacerbated, not letting Kim Jong-un off the hook at all, but look at it as the United States has also sort of contributed to this in part because some of the heated rhetoric that we tended to see, just from one side. What should we expect to see from the President's trip?
First, you're going to see the President articulate the post-pivot Asia strategy of the United States government. This is going to be based on the national security review that's been going on these last 9 months, as well as an Indo-Pacific strategy review that is still ongoing inside the interagency of the administration. You won't see those strategies fully revealed, but you'll hear outlines in the President's speeches, especially, I think, his rhetoric in Korea. Maybe at Camp Humphreys they're talking about. I think he'll be talking about the role of the security alliances and the future of them and U.S. commitment to our allies. I think those will be very important, reassuring words. His Korean strategy, from my perspective, North Korean strategy, from the Trump administration's North Korean strategy, is about maximizing pressure and hopefully converting it to diplomacy. We've heard a lot about the pressure, right? The military shows of force, the force enhancements, which we'll probably hear more about in terms of rotation of strategic assets through the Korean Peninsula and through the region. We've certainly heard about the economic strangulation and sanctions and secondary sanctions, and we've heard about the diplomatic isolation, such as votes at the UN Security Council, 15-0 against North Korea after the last nuclear test. But we haven't seen as much on the diplomacy front, and that's where China and South Korea in particular are really pushing President Trump to reveal a blueprint for diplomacy. And I think it'll be interesting to hear what the President does have to say that at least offers a vision for a diplomatic path. He has said a number of things that are seemingly contradictory over the last number of months. I see them as part of a desire plan to play a two-pronged strategy, but maximizing pressure at this point while North Korea is still provoking and moving toward a nuclear deployment of an ICBM, missiles that can hit the United States with nuclear warheads. He's trying to maximize the pressure, and then he has Secretary Tillerson working with other diplomats in the region, figuring out when's the right time you could look for diplomacy, if at all. And the problem here is that it may be that there is no opening until North Korea actually crosses a threshold that some in the administration have said is unacceptable, namely the deployment of a nuclear-tipped ICBM. But I think the administration is not interested in starting a war. They're interested in pressure for political outcome. So you'll hear that in Korea. You'll also see through Secretary Mattis and through General Dunford, the chairman, I think at the end of this trip in a place like Hawaii, pushing forward the trilateral cooperation with Japan and Korea. So although I credited Seoul and Tokyo for all that improvement, I give credit to Washington for continuing to push our two allies closer together for early warning, for readiness, and for possible action in the event of a contingency. This is a continuation of previous administration's policy, but it's the right thing to do, and the U.S. is still pursuing it, and I give them credit for that. Elsewhere in the region, you're going to hear more of an economic message in Vietnam. That's where the APEC summit is this year. But in Manila, at the last stop, which is the 50th anniversary of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Southeast Asian Grouping Organization. It's also the East Asia Summit, which has become an annual leaders meeting. This is going to be a place for the president to talk about counterterrorism with Marawi, the city in Mindanao that's just now finally expunged, reoccupied, now a broken city, a shattered city. It sort of resonates with places like Raqqa and the concern that we have internationally with urban warfare and with how you fight ISIS when they're able to seep into local insurgencies as they did in the Philippines, where there's long history of separatism and sectarianism, and it's being exploited by these outside groups, Daesh, the Islamic State. So I think that'll be part of that discussion as well. I think you're going to hear something on the maritime domain as well, but it's not going to be as loud as it might have been a couple of years ago when the South China Sea and the East China Sea really reared up in a big way as the Chinese were rushing to build these reclaimed rocks and atolls into outposts, military outposts in the Spratly Islands. But I think you will hear this through some of the interviews and some of maybe the speech in Cree even. We'll talk about the maritime domain as well as part of America's enduring long-term commitment in our history to open and free seas, navigation, in pursuing an Indo-Pacific strategy that includes countries like India, as well as Australia, as well as new Southeast Asian partners and our allies there, the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, a de facto ally, South Korea, Japan. I think all of this is going to be a reassuring message, but also a message of deterrence to North Korea, but deterrence with a purpose of getting to diplomacy. I think that's the hope that we're going to hear on the security front from the president.